I'm still wherever I was.
Well, but I see you now, John.
There we go.
That's made your day, Elaine. I'm sorry.
No, it's my fault. Elaine and Tom were talking about the ordinance change.
Yeah, I was making some reference to what had been done in Kennesaw, Georgia, in related to the purpose-built student housing discussion that I think David Allison made some comments about it on the document that I sent you earlier. And there are also it's a different type, but there's a way that they're addressing student housing in Alabama as well. So I don't know what we can and can't do in, let's see, Tom's not back here yet, is he? What we can and can't do in South Carolina or in Clemson, but I think the idea is to, how can we identify areas that we want to see high density student housing if we want to see it, and where that might be and how that might work for us. The reason I thought it was important for us to just take a look at this, the City Council and Planning Commission have a joint workshop tomorrow afternoon to kind of hammer out some of this language, and it'll be public. They won't take public comments, but there's a way you can view that workshop if you want to. It's at 5 o'clock tomorrow. I lost my train of thought now with that. But the reason I thought it was important for this group is because of the multifamily piece. Because if we're looking at, for us, and we're looking at ways to increase affordable housing, hopefully within the city limits of Clemson or for our residents, it's not going to happen in most of the single family neighborhoods because of the cost of land and the cost of houses that are there. So multifamily housing is going to be one of our options in a way to look for how we can provide some affordable housing. So this pending ordinance does address multifamily housing. But the one that went before the Planning Commission that we approved, but we approved it with the recommendation, and we don't approve it. We agreed to recommend it to City Council with the recommendation that some sort of time limit put on it, because it bans anything, the residential components of the non-residential zoning, but also it says multifamily and townhomes in there. We want to be careful not to put any constraints on something that could help us add to our affordable housing inventory here.
Elaine, I have a question about this. I think this is what I was trying to ask before, but I didn't. Is multifamily the residential of it, so that stops? What are the criteria we put on that? So it wouldn't stop townhomes, but we can be specific if it's the high rises. Is that what we can be specific on?
No, in that 9-page document I sent, there's a table of uses for residential districts. And at the bottom of the residential developments area section, so their use category is single family, which is our R12, R20 neighborhoods primarily.
Right.
2-family residential, which you'll find in RM1, RM2, RM3, and RM4. And then the residential developments, which would include patio homes, zero lot lines, conservation development. And at the very bottom, it's got townhouse development and multifamily development. Those are going to be limited by the number of beds per acre. So the RM
beds per acre, that's what we're talking. That's the kind of
per acre. Yeah, and what I think what council, what the implementation committee was trying to get at is you can have 56 beds or bedrooms per acre, but who's to say you can't put 2 sets of bunk beds in there and put 4 people in there? And that's what we're trying to get to, the language of how do we discuss this? Do we do it? Do we get more specific about the number of occupants as opposed to the number of beds? So that's some of the discussion that's going on. But the townhouse and the multifamily development have always been conditional in RM3, RM 3.5, and RM4. Well, the pending ordinance that the Planning Commission recommended takes all those out. But that was a discussion that was going on with implementation committee was not including those. We're really looking at, I think our control is good enough in the RM districts because we've got some control by how many beds per acre there can be. And the connection to what we're doing, as I said before, has to do with affordable housing. We don't want to put the brakes on anything that would add to affordable housing in our community.
Now,
So
one
we're really looking at the mixed use and the high density, like in the C district, CM district, and the CP, I think it's CP2 and 3. I don't think you can do it in CP1, but the commercial and the commercial mixed areas. And that's what this is trying to just kind of put a hold on it till we can finish looking at the white paper and developing the strategic plan as the way the residents, the planning commission, the city council want it for our community. So that's kind of where we are with that. And I don't know if I've explained that well enough or not.
Well, Elaine, let me ask you a question. The document that is circulating around now that Bob, apparently the implementation committee put together at your last meeting, or been working on it, but you published it after your last meeting. That document takes care, in my opinion, takes care of all the C districts. Because what it does is it limits or outlines everything. It requires them to come back as a PD, which gives them, really truthfully a broader approval authority situation. But at the same time, I think it safeguards against any litigation because you really haven't taken anything away. What you have done is you've basically set it up as a different way to approve it. So, I mean, to me, I guess that's what that document was all about. What you're talking about as far as the RM and all that, to me, is based on the way this document reads, all of that would stay as it has been and as it will be going forward. It doesn't change anything. So essentially everything I think that we were mostly at risk with is being addressed, I think, very nicely in this document that was published, I assume, after y'all's last meeting on Wednesday, which is, I assume, what we're going to talk about tomorrow.
Okay, I want to ask, because I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable here with what we're talking about. With that, we're not getting ahead of where people understand the zoning discussions. So does anybody have questions about, we're tossing out zoning codes of RMs and all this other stuff. I know y'all had a lot of questions about zoning. That's how we started with all this. What questions do you have about zoning that we can kind of talk about in terms of this change that is pending? Is everybody good?
Question. Do you have a list of the various codes, like the zoning codes, what each one stand for?
Yes.
Like you was talking about the CP2, John was the CP3, either Elaine, one of the two, and then the R codes and all that. Do you have a copy of that?
I will find the definitions are in the ordinance, the ordinance document, the Muni code, and I can at the very beginning of the chapter, but I'll find it and send it. I did not send it with this, but that's a very good question, Rosa. We need to understand what all of that means. And the
Wasn't that on 6 of what you sent out earlier today?
Right.
I mean, it's an abbreviated version, Rosa, but if you look at page 6 of the last document that Elaine sent out, if I'm not mistaken, it does define them briefly at the top of that.
Okay, I'll look. I've just been kind of preoccupied.
That is only for the residential districts, John. We didn't, I think maybe.
But I mean, I guess in a way though, our role here has probably less to do about commercial and more to do about residential.
Exactly.
I mean, I think what's happened with this document, which I'm very happy with, is that it takes the commercial districts, which were had allowed the mixed use, which we did up in the actual C, and then obviously in the CM, and it changes that. It doesn't take it away, but it just changes how you approach it. Mm-hmm. And it turns everything, in other words, if you want to do anything in any of the C districts now that includes housing, residential housing, it has to come forward as a PD.
Okay, but if I understand right, part of the issue, guys, that we're talking about is, and a PD is a plan development. So I'm trying to think, where's the plan development in Clemson? Do
Oh, we have,
any?
we have 22, I think. Patrick Square. That's a
Patrick Square,
prime
there's the easy
example of a
example.
big-
Sorry, I was
But also, Elaine, one of the downtown buildings, isn't the Earl Finley?
Earl Finley is mixed use.
No, but isn't it also a PD?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's a PD. Yes, it's a PD.
Yes, so that's an example of a PD, Catherine. In other words, it can be
Okay.
done as a large multi-story building.
Is Glenmark a PD?
Grandma, there will be a PD.
Yes.
Okay.
So the point is that in a plan development process, there is more control given and more, we know more. The challenge of a PD right now, and that's part of it for discussion at council, is that it has to include other types of use. But we're talking about the fact that maybe other types of use could be, I'm just throwing this out there, this is seriously just an example, a fire department branch, a police department branch, a branch of OLLI, lifelong learning, that it doesn't have to be commercial, it could be institutional or
Correct.
city development.
That's correct.
Something like that.
It could include,
So
it could include the Arts Center.
So part of the discussion is that. Now, where this gets fuzzy is what Todd seems to want, and what some of the discussion is that if a developer goes the route of a PD, then he wants to allow them to increase the density with no additional cost. I do not favor that. I think that we are already the pretty girl at the prom and we don't need to be giving it away for free anyway. But that's the idea of a planned development, is that both sides have a little bit more give and take in what they do, which, Elaine, please correct me if I'm wrong. Right now, without a PD, once it's approved by the plant, once we kind of get a development approved, then we lose control, like, oh, I don't know, Dockside, for example.
Well, Dockside is following everything that's allowed in our ordinances. So if we
Right.
move forward,
And
with the last version, they're doing
If-
what's allowed in CP2, which was already zoned CP2.
Yeah, CP2, you're right.
And the failure then was the fact that we didn't have density in place that we needed to make that happen. But now go back to what you just said a second ago, Catherine. If you read the document that was prepared, the intent is to control density in the PD. I know Todd's got one view of it, but the view that's been put forth by the ClemsonNext crowd is intended to, it says currently density setters are set by the bedroom, but so essentially it's intended to set maximum densities and actually have annual construction and annual inspection. So I do believe if we were to go forward with this document, this is a good document, a strong document, and I don't think it leaves yourself open for any. I mean, anybody can try to sue you, but I think at the end of the day, it takes a lot of their arguments off the table.
I honestly am past the point of worrying about being sued. I mean, when we got lawyers just threatening, I mean, standing there coming to city council, I don't really worry about that. But
Well, I mean, but again, what I'm saying is in this situation, they talk about taking, quote unquote, taking. Well, by going this route, even with these standards in there, I don't think you're taking anything, because he can still do certain things.
okay, so back to the discussion that we're having here about affordable housing, guys. So I want to make sure that we're getting everybody's ideas on the zoning discussion. So what do you guys think about how this could affect based on ClemsonNext and some of the growth patterns? What questions do you have that either we need to answer for you, or that that maybe some of your neighbors have? Chad, one of the questions I have is, Chad, as we look at this and we think about the Green Crescent Trail, are there other things that we need to think about protecting along that, the planned route? Are there things that, and I'm not putting you on the spot that you have to answer me today, that's not it, but that maybe as we look at this, are there things for planned developments and growth that, I mean, I think about the Swamp Rabbit Trail and making sure we're thinking about things ahead of time.
This might not be directly related, but I've also been going to the Transportation Implementation Committee, and one thing they wanted to relay to this group was that the conversation has been around having student developments or high density developments tied to some kind of fee in lieu where is used for transportation and or affordable housing or both. So I don't know. I know we've had that conversation. I missed a couple meetings on this group, but I guess whatever comes about in the end is thinking about having, if you're going to let some steam off, you are going to have some kind of multifamily property where it's appropriate and the types of terms as appropriate with the type, you have some control over it, whatever that looks like, just making sure you're getting some community benefit from that, whether both affordable housing and the Green Crescent Trail fits under the public transit, but it could also be cat bus, could be, I think all of those fit together. Affordable housing, if you can have people able to use the bus and or walk or bike from one place to another, that's going to make the next place over more affordable. So I think that, I guess I'm just putting that out there to decide how do we make sure that's whatever that rule is, that there's some kind of ability to have a fee in lieu, or I don't know if that's an impact fee, what that looks like, but that was the conversation that was brought up there as well. So it seemed to be common to this group too.
No, I think that's really good. And I mean, you brought up a point too about even just thinking about the transportation routes. And I think that's really important. I know that Andy or somebody said they were happy with kind of the discussions ongoing with the cat bus group, but I'm not sure where that's headed or when.
Well, here's a good example. You're taking the project that's under construction essentially at Berkeley and Cambridge. There's like 400 beds going in there. Well, that's on the cat bus route. Now, it's obviously student housing, but it would have been a perfect situation had we been further down the road here for that to have been a mix of student housing and workforce housing and possibly even affordable housing all right there in that one complex. Had we been further down the road with this particular situation here, where you could have pushed that into that, and it would have been on a transit route.
Okay.
I've got a few comments, if you can bear with me. I agree with John that the PD process is, in my mind, maybe a good replacement for what I think of as the BAR process. And I realize that this does not say everything that it could say. My favorite part of parts 1 through 5 is the end of part 3, where there are new standards for minimizing the impacts of new developments. There's part of me that wishes I was seeing more of that kind of language in this. Okay, so when we have PDs must conform to the vision, goals, and size and character, I wish that said revised vision of goals, size, and character. Yeah. I kind of wonder what, this relates to that. If you go to number 5, I wonder what the BZA's role in this is and when it comes in. And I kind of wish that the density, environmental, social, cultural impacts were included under that first statement of vision. Yeah, I don't know why it's been put off to number 5. When we're talking about the bedroom issue, and this partly worries me when we look at number 4, where we're going to have purpose-built student housing. I wish there were a way to make sure that whatever purpose-built student housing means, that it would also be built so that people who had families could move into them, and also so that the handling of leases would encourage families who could live there for long term. And what I mean by long term would be things like 2 to 3 years. Anyway, there's part of me that agrees with John that this is an improvement, but it looks to me when I read it as if there's a readiness to give too much away.
Well, Bill, let me go back to that first thing you said about revised vision. Where did you pick that up? Where you said vision?
Okay, well, I'm in number 2. Okay,
Number-
PD must conform to the vision, and it's got to be a revised vision. I'm sorry, the
Okay,
BAR.
okay. No, that's fine. I'm just making notes. Okay, I'm just making notes.
The BAR has been following a vision, and we know what that looks like now.
Right, we do. And I mean, you're right. This could very well take the place of the BAR. But I still think we can tighten this up. I know what you're saying, but I think we can tighten this up.
Yeah. Anyway, those are my comments.
So Bill, let me say this about the BZA part. Part of the discussion with the implementation committee not last week, the week before, when this document came up, the BZA part was if 2 options. One, we could change the conditional use to special exceptions. And if it's a special exception, it's kind of like a variant. So that would be what the BZA would do. If it's a PD, then it goes through the planning commission. So I think that's why that language is in there. Catherine, what he's talking about are the numbers in that recommendation I sent this morning. Yeah, that one
That's
from
what
the committee. Yeah.
pulled it up.
So it starts with there's number 1 through 5 that's what Bill is talking about, what's in there.
Yeah.
I get what he's saying about the being able to use student housing for families as well, but I don't, that's why we would have a purpose-built student housing zoning, so that everything that's being built, which is what all of those mixed use things are doing right now, they're building it specifically for students with the tiny combined living area, kitchen area, larger bedrooms, very little storage. The bedrooms each have their own bathroom and they lock. So it makes it like a little small development within each one of the units. So I get what you're saying with that, but this would allow us to figure out where the best place to put those. A purpose-built student housing zoning would tell us where to best put those. And anything in other places would be more traditional that would work for families like you're talking about, Bill.
Can I make one more comment about that? There's part of me, again, I'm probably being impractical, but I do not think we should have areas set aside for purpose-built student housing until we see our neighbor, the university, come up with a plan about how it is going to implement more student housing on its own property.
I was going to say, they have a plan, Bill. It's just to let us do it.
Yeah, well, I understand that. And so, but the plan should be, and I don't know how it is anybody with the authority of the city council can do anything about it. But it seems to me that the city should not concede that student housing should be built in Clemson.
Now, I don't disagree. And I apologize, Bill. I didn't mean to be flippant. I just, after having a couple of those conversations, that's all I got left is sarcasm.
Well, no, I understand. There were a couple of years that I sat in on the University City meetings, and they were just terrible. So anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, I think that's a good point. And, you know, I have thought something similar, not as nice as what you just said in the past, which is that if we just stopped allowing the development, then maybe the university would figure it out. And I know that's not a solution, for the record, for anybody who listens to this recording. I'm just saying that sometimes that's what happens in my brain. And I think that's where I think we have to figure that out. And I don't know, Elaine, what you said makes perfect sense. John, how did that number 4 create the purpose-built housing? Is there any discussion, and I'm going to go to what Bill said, that we could have apartments, but they're not rented per bed? Does that change the zoning? Like if it's just a normal apartment, like what almost all of us on this call rented at one point in time, that it was just an apartment.
Well, I think that I can't honestly answer that, but I do think that as we go towards these catalyst areas, do we create a student housing zone, for example? So then you would create zoning. So if you remember the various catalyst areas, and the only one I think, in my opinion, that's even doable is the triangle out there near Tillman Place across, 93 and 76. I think that is actually a real possibility. But you could change the zoning in that and it'd be designated for student housing, that's some type of zoning, and you could build that out as you wanted it to be, for example. Maybe allow it to be higher. Maybe you allow it to be more dense because that is where you want the student housing to be. Or for example, and I know this is really kind of a pipe dream because I think the land costs would kill you, but the area, and it's behind Dotted Hills there where Daniel Square and 99 Wyatt is located right now, that's in a hole. If that were to be rebuilt as high density student housing, you could probably go higher there too. And the nice thing about that, they would be close to campus from a walking perspective, but even Tillman Place would be close enough to campus to walk and or bike because it'd be fairly easy to establish the bike trails coming in from Tillman Place. So, but I think the land cost for Daniel Square and 99 Wyatt is prohibitive. I don't know how they could possibly put that together.
A lot of those are individually owned, aren't they, John? The units?
Yeah, that's the
They are-
problem. Once you started, buying them up, then they go up. I think that, I don't even know how many units are in there, but you're probably talking $200,000 a copy. So I think the land cost alone there would be probably close to $20 million.
Wow.
I think they'd be much more than 200,000 a piece as well.
Well, particularly when people started buying them up.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you guys think? I mean, we've talked about this, and it's coming up tonight, or tomorrow night, tonight and tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night.
Yeah, tomorrow night's the working session. Do you guys have thoughts, what you'd like us to ask? Are there things that we need to know as we fill this in? Make sure we get everybody's questions asked and answered.
Will there be any land left for houses or designated houses? I mean, is there going to be places for, because Clemson is known as a, Jesus, not that, but Clemson is known as a retirement center. Everybody's not staying in a retirement home. There are people that want homes. Is there going to ever be enough land that we can still be family?
And
I mean, that's how Clemson thrive off the families, because when everybody else is gone, the families is the one to keep Clemson going. And I think, and I don't care about the university, but they need to find their own. I mean, really, it's recorded, send it to them. But yeah, I mean, they leaving out people that helps the city grow. We know about growth, but they taking over. I'm just curious.
Well, that's
Yeah, along with what Rose is saying, it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about with affordable family housing is apartments and units like that. So I second what Rose is saying about having land for individual family homes. And I'm late to the game here, so maybe this has been answered before, but I'm also curious about preserving current home ownership and land, especially by Black Clemson residents. So I'm just curious where we are in the conversation with making sure that I know that putting certain conditions on new development is in part designed to protect our Black and African American communities. But what else is going on to protect Black land and home ownership?
Well, I think that, that's part of what the Shaw Center is about, but I think we are going to have to come up with ways for preservation of those 5 neighborhoods. But to your point, Sam, I mean, they are the people that own that property, and in some cases they just choose to sell. I mean, a classic example, and I don't know what'll happen to it, but a piece of property over on Goldman is just now come under contract. I don't know who the buyer is, but I mean, you can only hold your breath and hope it's not somebody that's got different plans for that neighborhood and just trying to basically buy it up a parcel at a time. So, I mean, that is a real issue. I do think though that in most of those neighborhoods, the people that live there, and Rosa can answer this better than I can, but from what we have found, those neighborhoods want to stay intact. The people that live in those neighborhoods want to stay there. They like their neighborhoods and they like their neighbors. So they're not motivated. They're really not motivated to sell. And thus, if they're not, then the fact for them to be redeveloped in another form or fashion is a little bit more difficult because of that. But as generations change, there's always that risk unless we come up with a way to historically preserve them. And I think that's something we're going to have to look at very closely.
So there are multiple places in the comprehensive plan that talk about protecting neighborhoods and not rezoning anything that's RM 12, R20, which is the single family designation. The thing Sam's talking about that I think we need to do more investigation about is how can we use something like an overlay? How can we protect those neighborhoods that you mentioned and that Rosa was talking about and John was talking about? Those are already zoned RM2 and RM3, so they're zoned for multifamily units. I don't know that we can go back and get them back to a single family zoning, or if we would even want to. But I think we do need to see what are the ways that we can provide some layer of protection for those that would keep them from the next developer. And I won't use any names, but there's one that's buying properties all over town. He's bought a bunch of them and several of them are joining. So I don't know what the plans are if you start to pull multiple lots together that join, then if they're in an RM3, there's not a lot you can do as long as what they plan to do is in line with what the zoning would allow.
And people that's elderly, I might consider myself as being somewhat elderly, but
Rosa.
but then we're not interested in being around a bunch of students. I mean, that's fair out and true.
Agreed, Rosa.
I mean, we're not interested in that. And even you got to think about the people, even though you might have people come traveling in and want to reside here in Clemson, and maybe in the African-American neighborhood, nobody's never given no one a chance to want to build in the African-American neighborhood. Maybe they can pay for a $200,000 home, but the opportunity does not present itself being taken away. There's one man that is live in the ABL community. I know for a fact, one of the someone was trying to buy his land, but he decided to put a mini golf course on top of his land and repaired all his stuff. And he said, "No way, I'm not selling," you know. But no, they're not giving people an opportunity for the community to grow. Because yes, people are getting older, kids are moving away, but everybody ain't dead. So, you know, there's not room, huh?
I think you're right. And the challenge is just like we've seen in other neighborhoods, and especially in some of our historic Black neighborhoods, is that once they start buying up a few things here and there, then the other remaining families are like, well, why am I here if they're doing all this crap next to me and right down the street from me? I mean, I get it.
And then do we have enough police force? I'm on Central about this. If there's enough police force to cover all these apartments and people that's moving in for a temporary 9 months. So it's really something to think about, huh?
This is Eunice. I think we have learned that we can change the zoning from R2 and 3 in the historically Black neighborhoods and give them the R20 and 12 if that's better for them. And I think similarly, the historically white neighborhoods don't all need to be R12 and R20. Those should also be zoned to have duplexes, triplexes, like the neighborhood I live in. So the folks that, like, if the historically Black neighborhoods need better zoning, that can be changed. It's not permanent. It's a lot of effort, but it can be changed.
Okay.
And there is Because there is the opportunity for grandfathering properties in, non-conforming properties in those neighborhoods can be grandfathered in.
And
Okay.
remember, Elaine Masseri, who some of you may know from various council meetings, she lives almost next door to me. Elaine asked me a question that about the deed restrictions, and deed restrictions I'm not sure, override isn't quite the right word, but deed restrictions can be much stricter than zoning. The only exception is an owner of a house property can put a deed restriction on. The only thing it does not do is, so for example, Elaine's house here in Delwood, she could not have a deed restriction that allowed for multifamily homes. That's not allowed in the zoning. So that's
Okay.
the only way. I'm gonna try and make sure I say that right. But so that is something that we can encourage people to, protect their property. I'm not sure how that would work as a movement, but I like this idea of kind of having student designated areas. I agree with Bill too, is that I worry that there's no property left to even develop.
Well, I think one of the things we have to consider at Clemson over time is there's properties that will have to be redeveloped as they continue to age out. In some cases, they can be redeveloped in a different form or a different look, and I think that's something we have to consider as well. I mean, if you think about the Finley, not the Finley, the old Finley structure, what was there before was terrible. We just didn't envision it becoming what it is, but it did take out some really, really old, really, really dilapidated obviously smaller scale student housing back in there.
Catherine, may I ask you, under the train trestle for the frat house, when you take a right, you go up, take a right, then you bear to the left, then you got a fork in the road and you go to the right, and everything is beautiful till you get ready to go across that little stanky pond right there. It's where it was a pond. Why are they not doing something with all that?
I think that's one of the ClemsonNext neighborhoods. John probably knows it better than I do. And that's that north side. That's one of the communities to be developed in
that's to be redeveloped. That is a target area. That would be considered a target area for redevelopment, Rosa. But again, now you got to understand that all that property is individually owned pieces in there, so you'd have to buy it up and do so. But yes, that's a classic situation, just what you described there for redevelopment. And there are others like that on that side of the railroad trestle, just like you described. You're headed in the right direction. There are some in there.
Okay.
You're saying, John, that that's one that was designated in that plan presented as an opportunity, or is that something? Okay.
No, that was in the white paper. That area back in there is considered, an opportunity for redevelopment. Yes, it is.
I don't remember that being a catalyst zone, though. If I remember, I don't have it right in front of me. It was an area that's likely to be redeveloped because the prices are a little bit lower, and it's also relatively close to campus. But I don't know that it was one of the catalyst zones where they talked about completely putting an overlay and changing the zoning and that sort of thing. But
So when you say it's an opportunity for redevelopment, what do you mean? Because right now, that is one of the only areas in town that is affordable for people who aren't students.
And that's
where I perk up,
Well, no, I understand, but I mean, and you're right about that. It is typically there's not that many students back in there. It's families back in there. And the rent factors, I don't even know what they are, but I'm certain they're down to that point. But you're right. But again, because of those properties and everything, Lillian, I think that still could be targeted for some form of multifamily housing that would be deemed either workforce or affordable housing. But I mean, you've got to have a developer that is willing to kind of go down that path, and not a developer is looking at it from student housing. The one that frustrates me the most is Curtis, which is directly across from Cam. And there's a developer who's gone in there and he's built, I don't even want to call it a duplex. I don't know what it is, but I mean, it's going to be 4 units in there, and they're going to be, it's going to be probably 12 to 16 beds right there across from Cam. So they took property right within the Calhoun, what we call it, I guess the Calhoun neighborhood, and they turned that into student housing right there. And it backs up to Crawford Falls, but that's not what it should have been, but it was, or is.
What makes me sad about that property, John, is those 2 lots were originally owned by Habitat for Humanity, and they're the ones that sold it to the developer.
Wow.
Well, and they're doing that in Central as well. That's a whole nother issue is you're going to have, well, it's not a discussion for here, but people who have Habitat homes often don't have the legal knowledge to back up when somebody comes in and says, let's do this. And there was a Habitat home in Central where there was an area, a triangular piece of property that the homeowner was going to have to sell so that the city would be able to allow a development. And simply because that homeowner did their research and said absolutely not, that development couldn't move forward and they had to completely change. So there's a lot of, but that's a Shaw Center thing that we can, help with education on that front.
Yeah, Lord.
I think that education piece, whatever we need to do to make that happen sooner rather than later, I think that is such an important thing we need to do.
Yes. I was in a house today that needs some work, and the question was asked about a will, and there's not one. So that's just a process. And again, that's, I think, something like Lillian said, that's the intent of the Shaw Center. In addition to working on those homes, it's also helping with situations just like with the lack of a will.
Yeah, for real.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and I don't want to waste your time. And honestly, we have another meeting at 5:30. So what I want is if you guys will tell me what we're missing, I'm going to write this up. And one of the things that I really want us to explore and is this idea of kind of student designated, 2 things, kind of a student designated zone for student housing. And then the other thing is what I forget who brought it up, is the idea of just having apartments and what can we do to have apartments that aren't bed driven so that they could be more rented to families. People who need apartments. It's so weird to me that they figured out how to do this by bed. And so that's one of the things that we'll also write up and we'll look into. I will make sure that everybody gets, Rosa, that the municipal codes will go through all the zoning stuff so that everybody has that kind of dictionary. And is there anything else I'm forgetting?
I have, Catherine, I have written down things that we were talking about as we went through the meeting, and I'm hoping that once we get a handle on all of this, we can decide on small groups of, you talked about this earlier, maybe 3 or 4 people working together or researching some of these areas. But we talked about the possibility of overlays, and I don't, if they would work to help protect some of the neighborhoods. The possibility of deed restrictions. The interesting thing about deed restrictions is they run with the property. So if you put a deed restriction on it and you sell it and they buy it with that restriction, then it goes with the property. They can't take it off. The person who originally put it on has to. The rezoning or downzoning, how that would work, and if that would work for some of the things we want to do in some of the areas. The education piece being important. And I think, John, that's something we can, and Rosa, we can work with on the Shaw Center to start doing some of that if we have ideas of what kinds of topics need to be presented, and then take it to the people and making it available. The student designated zoning or purpose-built student housing, and then apartments that aren't bed driven. So that's like 6 areas that I think we could further investigate and decide how best to set the goals for what we want to do with this non-student housing section.
Elaine, can I ask a stupid question? What exactly is an overlay? We've sort of batted that around, and I think I know what it is, but I probably do not.
And Bill if Bill's still with us, he might can answer this better, because as I understand it, we have a bunch of overlay districts and they apply standards that might be architectural design. I don't know. There's an overlay district downtown. I was curious as to how that one little tiny, very modern building is going to fit in the architectural overlay that we have for the downtown section. And I've not got really good answers on it. And I don't necessarily have a good handle on it, but I don't know if anybody else here has.
Bill,
a-
you know,
Okay, we've got architectural review districts right now. And that's overseen by the BAR. And I think what ClemsonNext is thinking about, and they probably found the law in the found the word in the law that underwrites planning. And there's a notion of overlay districts. Okay, and I think it's really up to the community to decide how those work. Okay, and my problem the last time we met was that I am not quite sure how overlay became architectural review districts. Okay. In other words, it seems to me that they could be other things. And I'll admit I've got a problem with the BAR. And you know, I'd like to see things separated from them. But it seems to me that, you know, the overlay thing, if people can come up with very clear ideas of what they were supposed to do, I think the faster you can do it, if you can't rezone places quickly, the faster you can do it. So the duplexes that John is talking about don't pop up. And we can kind of get a sense of what it is that people that live in neighborhoods actually want to have happen, and have their desires determine what's going on, rather than the amount of money that is available to other people. That's, you know, but anyway, overlay is something that is suggested in the South Carolina law. And it seems to me that the ClemsonNext people who wrote the thing picked up the word, and it is a suggestion. So I know that in ClemsonNext there is an overlay suggested right along here on the other side of Addison Lane for me, which is supposed to be for the student development. So they've got these ideas where they're going to put overlays where certain kinds of things can happen, and it sounds to me like they've got it in mind. And I'm not sure that the council or the planning commission does, but they have in mind this notion that what happens is you decide there's an overlay, then you decide what happens.
okay. And for the record, Bill, you win the t-shirt competition today.
I know, I was just thinking of that. I think with an overlay district, you can't change the underlying zoning. Like if it's RE2, you can't make it different from that, but you can.
Right.
I'm just looking up stuff right now.
Yeah.
It adds an additional layer of standards. So I don't know how we could make that work in like our historically Black neighborhoods, or how. I think it's worth looking at. Is there some sort of overlay district we can add to that would help provide some more protection for those neighborhoods?
Well, certainly what happens is we need to get clear about that, because there's part of me that thinks zoning them into R12, R20 is probably the best thing to do. But I'd want to know whether or not the people who live in those areas really want that to happen. In other words, is it a possibility? Is it what they really want to have happen? And you know, that discussion should be going on 3-4 months ago. You know, and I don't know how. You know, I don't know enough people, and I don't have enough connections to get it happening. But it needs to have started.
So let me make sure I understand this, because if I'm going to start something, I want to make sure I do it right, Bill.
Yeah.
Is what needs to start is the discussion about the overlay, or the under the foundation under the overlay.
I think you've got to talk about both things at once. You got to explore whether or not rezoning will work. At the same time, you are exploring how overlay can actually work. Because if the rezoning doesn't work, and people don't want it, then you need to think about it in terms of what the overlay can do.
And is the idea of an overlay to sort of protect a zone?
It is,
area?
what you do is you establish standards that go beyond what the zoning.
Oh, okay. So it's beyond the zone.
And so if you're worried about affordable housing, okay, the zoning will say, you know, you can put this kind of unit in, you can put in this kind of unit. But if you're worried about affordable housing, then you can do with the overlay, I think, what you can do is to say, well, if you were going to build a unit that has a building that has 4 residential units in it, 2 of them have to be affordable. Okay, however you define it.
No, that's helpful. That's really a good idea. Sorry, dog in the
And
way.
Kathleen, that may be where we can designate them as not by the individual bedroom, but rather by the apartment, by the unit.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea because Todd's always throwing the zoning thing up at me. But if we can talk about overlays, that might be an interesting way to do it.
Right. And I have an email that I put together for I think Bob and several others on the implementation committee, where I had done the research about the purpose-built student housing in Kennesaw and in Alabama. Let me go back and find that, and I'll share it with this committee. That might give us a little more insight into that perspective.
Okay. Well, guys, I appreciate it. I know some people had to go pick up kids and everything, and I know Chad had another meeting. We'll write all this up, but I really appreciate your input today. Elaine and I were talking, we want to make sure everybody gets involved. So if you have questions, please let us know. And we're going to probably have assignments for people in the next week or 2. You'll have homework and everything. And Bill, thank you very, very much for all that information. That was really helpful.
All right, thank y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you soon.